Hello, and welcome to our podcast where we read the Bible and talk about its cultural, political, and historical and religious significance. I'm your host, Andrew, along with your co-host, Stephen.
Good evening.
And today we are moving on. This is episode 8. We finally made it, so it's been a long time since the last one. But we are moving on to a new thing now, and we're doing a parallel thing where we're going to be doing the Old Testament and the New Testament in tandem. So that we can actually get through it. And we're going to start today on the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament or the Renewed Covenant or whatever you'd like to call it. And yeah, so I did want to talk about one thing really quick before we get to it. Hopefully that won't take too long, though. We're already 50 seconds in. Somebody might be getting impatient. We got our first piece of real feedback. we got our first piece of real feedback on episode 1, and the comment went something like this. I'm just going to read it to you. Jesus Christ, shut the fuck up. The reading starts at 4 minutes and 6 seconds. So thank you, YouTube, for that.
Of all the comments we could get.
So he starts off by taking the Lord's name in vain, and then he tells us to shut our pie hole, and then he complains that it takes 4 minutes out of an hour-long podcast to get to the actual Bible reading.
Just be glad it only took 4 minutes.
Yeah, I don't know that I could design a worse comment for that, honestly.
Your response to him was quite...
I was very polite. I tried to be very polite. Sort of. Yeah. Try to be polite about it. So we're encroaching on 2 minutes here, so hopefully if this guy's still around, he's not flipping it off already. 2 whole minutes.
We might not even get into the reading yet.
Well, we might not get into that much of the actual reading today just because we want to talk about Mark and the Gospel itself before we actually start reading it. Anybody can pick up a copy of the Bible and read it, right? I mean, that's part of the whole problem, is that what do you get out of it? Well, it's not a problem. What I mean is, what do you get out of it to just do that? There's so much more that you're not going to get just by reading it. That's why we're having these discussions, honestly. I mean, if you really just wanted to read, there's plenty of places you can go. We were just talking about this before we started recording. There's plenty of places you can go to just hear someone read the Bible. There's plenty of Bibles everywhere. You shouldn't have to buy one. And you can just read it yourself. I mean, if that's what you want to do. There's churches and everything. So this is partially about reading it, but it's also a lot about the discussion too. So if you're not really interested in hearing us talk about it, and there's a lot of interesting things to say, especially from Stephen. He's the one who knows everything. I'm just the idiot who's here along for the ride. There's you're going to hear stuff on this podcast, hopefully, that you didn't already know and that you'll find interesting and that will maybe help put things into perspective and context that you wouldn't get just by reading it yourself. So I really hope that anyone who's listening can appreciate that. And if not, there's other resources out there. We're not offended if you don't like it. So just our first official piece of feedback, real feedback. Just wanted to address that. So if you happen to be the person who wrote that comment and you're still listening, thank you, and hopefully you found the previous 7 episodes interesting enough you'll stick around for this one and in the future. We're not going anywhere. It may seem like a long time between releases, but we do plan on doing this for as long as we can, probably. So just to give some idea of what the general structure of this episode is going to be like for people who might be impatient, we're going to talk about Mark, and we're going to talk about the actual Gospel, the history of it a little bit before we start the reading. So the reading is going to be later in the episode, and we may not get too far into it in this episode, but then it should pick up after that. So it's not going to be a slow reading every episode. This is sort of an intro into the Gospel of Mark, and that'll probably continue with the other ones where we'll have an introduction. We'll talk about Matthew and Luke and John, and there'll be intro episodes for those too. So that's just what you can expect. All right, so what I've done is I've looked up some cursory information, and I wrote down things that stood out to me, and they're basically just going to be conversation starters, because I think Stephen is much more knowledgeable about these things than I am, and I don't trust myself to get the facts out of the cursory reading, and I don't have time. If I had time to go spend hours and hours researching this stuff, then I wouldn't need to do the podcast, so...
You wouldn't be asking me to help.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the Gospel of Mark was written by a guy named Mark, also known as John Mark, also known as Mark the Evangelist. And from what I've gathered just cursorily, is that he was sort of a follower, a mouthpiece for Peter.
That's correct, yeah.
That is correct. Okay, so that's right.
Yeah.
And basically Peter picked him up, and then he was espousing, basically, and paraphrasing Peter's stuff. And to that extent, the actual Gospel of Mark was written, in Wikipedia it says either in Syria or Palestine, or two possible places. It was written in Greek for non-Jewish Christians. And so that's sort of a part of what goes into the way it was written, that it elaborates on some of the Jewish customs and stuff like that, because these people wouldn't be familiar with that. He was one of the first bishops, one of the first ever bishops, Episcopal bishops, for the Catholic Church, which makes sense if he was hanging out with Peter, right? But the most fascinating thing, and just stop me if I'm saying anything wrong here.
You said quite a few things that are wrong.
Okay, well, let's address those, and then we'll move on to the other stuff.
No, I'd like to finish.
You want to do it all? Okay.
Just go through it all, and then we'll go back. And go through those points one at a time.
Whenever he referenced the Old Testament, he did so using the Greek Septuagint. So his reference for the Old Testament was the Greek Septuagint translation and not the Hebrew. Sounds like he was all Greek all the way. His was the first gospel, and there's something else called the Q, which may or may not exist, and it's basically just sayings or whatever from Jesus. And the idea of the two-source hypothesis is that you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew and Luke, they both are mostly made up of Mark and this Q source, which may have been oral, it may have been written, it may have been from the church, but it may not even exist. But there's some common elements to Luke and Matthew that are not in Mark. So the idea is that they found things that are in Mark that are in Luke and Matthew, and then they also found common things that are in Luke and Matthew that weren't in Mark, and supposedly these came from Q, so that's the two-source hypothesis, that Luke and Matthew are basically made up of Mark and Q and a little bit of their own stuff. And since John's gospel came later, that would make Mark's actually the very first gospel, and it's written in a literary style that's different from the rest of the New Testament. This is all the stuff that I've gathered so far. You already said I had stuff wrong, so that's pretty much the end of the list. And there is a secret gospel of Mark. The secret, the secret gospel of Mark. One other interesting thing, the Messianic secret. This idea that he was basically going around making everyone sign a non-disclosure agreement or something, telling people, he was basically doing the whole Clark Kent thing, don't tell anyone I'm Superman, I'll get rid of your hepatitis, but you can't tell anyone, this kind of...
Right, okay, oh, God, where the hell to start with all that? Well, first of all, let's go through Mark's actual name. His actual name in Greek would be Marcos. So it's Marcos rather than Mark. We kind of remove the last two letters for some strange reason. It's from Latin, unfortunately. John Mark, unfortunately, I think he's only... Yes, that's from Acts. Acts chapter 12. It says also the one called John, also known as Mark. So when it comes to Mark, we don't quite know whether he was a Jew, whether he was a Gentile, because he's known mainly as Mark, but yet he has the Jewish name John, or Yochanan, meaning cherished of Yahweh, or something like that. Oddly enough, in the Gospel of Mark, as it's known, Mark isn't mentioned. Mark's name is not mentioned there whatsoever. In fact, Mark is mainly mentioned in Acts, which was written by Luke, may not have been, but essentially that's where it comes down through to Mark. There's a few references in what's known as the disputed letters of Paul. Colossians 4 verse 10 mentions Mark. 2 Timothy 4 verse 11 also mentions Mark. The only official undisputed letters that mention him would be Philemon. He's just in a list. Well, there's a Marcos mentioned. Whether it's the same Mark or not is completely different. So a person named Mark is mentioned several times throughout the Renewed Covenant. Whether they're the same Mark, different Marks, made up Mark, it's just one of those things. A Mark is mentioned. It's usually assumed that they're the same person. But obviously Mark was quite a common name back then, Marcos. We got Mark Antony, the Roman, ex-Roman emperor. So it was quite a common name. So whether someone was a
Could
Jew...
have been different Marks.
Yeah, it could have been different Marks, could be the same Mark. I've already said that, haven't I? Problem is, we don't know. It's all... we call it the Gospel of Mark, yet, as I said, it doesn't even mention his name.
It's funny, though, because I saw that, too, that it doesn't mention... It's not signed by him or nothing like that. I know some of the other books of the Bible, it'll say that I'm this person or whatever, and I'm writing it. There's nothing like that, so you wouldn't know just by looking at it that it was written by Mark. But it seems like the oral tradition is just unbroken, you know?
Yeah, it started almost instantaneously from what we can see. Because, you know, when it comes down to the four eyewitness accounts, we've got Matthew, Marcos, Mark, Lucas, Luke, and Joachim and John. The first three, you know, why those three? Why put a name like Matthew to it if it wasn't by Matthew? Matthew was only mentioned like 3 times,
right,
throughout the whole of the New Covenant. It's not like it's not called the Gospel of Peter. Oddly enough, the Gospel of the writing known as the Gospel of Peter is known as apocryphal forgery. So choosing these basically unknown people and saying, right, it was by them, it makes it quite plausible that they were written by those 3, because they're just 3 random people that have very little to do with anything else compared to, you know, other people mentioned.
Yeah, you'd think if there was, you know, there would be some contention. But there's none, it seems like, so.
Basically, it was like these 16 chapters, these 16 chapters, basically, quite early on, Mark wrote. Again, it's all speculative and hypothesized and everything. It's hypothesized that Mark here is actually writing them, basically being Simon Petrus's scribe for him. Basically, Simon Peter saying things out to Mark, and he's just writing them down. But again, that's just an oral tradition.
Yeah, you would think that if he was really taking all this stuff from Peter, you know, this is really, in some ways, the Gospel of Peter, not Mark.
Yeah, it would be, but oddly enough, Willie, it's called the Gospel of Mark.
Well, I know it's called the Gospel of Mark, but really, it's the ideas of Peter, not Mark.
Which is kind of funny, because when it comes to Mark's eyewitness accounts, and we look, you know, when we look back to see quotes from and also earliest manuscripts of Mark prior to Codex Sinaiticus in the middle of the 4th century CE. As far as we know, there is only one manuscript to contain anything from Mark's eyewitness account, which is very odd considering it's very early. It was brought out that it was stated that he was writing the memoirs of Peter. Yet there's only one manuscript which actually only has 6 chapters of the 16 extant, and even then, that's not full chapters. That's parts of 6 chapters. Not even a full manuscript compared to like when it comes to like John and Matthew, when we have 16 or 17 manuscripts containing at least 80%, and in the case of John's eyewitness account, almost 95%. So, and then obviously Luke's we've more or less got from start to finish. But again, that's like 12 manuscripts. But when it comes to Mark, there's just one, which is very, very odd. Because basically, the more manuscripts you find is quite the data and statistics would indicate that Matthew and John were very popular, extremely popular, and Mark really was kind of ignored.
Well, you said that there was a Gospel of Peter that was considered apocryphal.
Mm-hmm.
How closely does that line up with Mark?
Oh, not at all.
Not at all. Oh, I see.
Not at all.
That seems odd to me, though. You'd think they would be more closely in line then.
Well, if you want, actually, Andrew, I have a translation and a transliteration of the only Gospel of Peter manuscript that we have up on the way to Yahweh, so I can download and read it. Because then you'll see what I mean.
Well, I was actually thinking that at some point we could do some one-offs where we do all the apocryphal Gospels, and sort of one episode each, and just each apocryphal Gospel would just get its own episode, But I just if Mark really was following Peter,
mm-hmm.
you would expect there to be a lot of similarities. And
well,
wouldn't you? I mean,
no. Well, it basically, obviously, they put. But again, even though it's called the Gospel of Peter,
it may not have been Peter.
It may not have been Peter's
right.
Gospel. The other issue is when the Gospel of Peter is mentioned, we're at near the end of the 2nd century CE when it starts getting talked about. So basically, it's not. But when it comes to Mark, it's talked about, at least from the beginning of the 2nd century, not at the end, or probably at the end of the 1st century CE. So when it comes to the Gospel of Peter, it's the fact that it's such a late date that people start eventually talking about it is a good indication that it's a forgery that was written in the mid 2nd century to probably put forth a apocryphal or Gnostic type dogma or doctrine forward, rather than people going, it's called the Gospel of Peter, let's all start copying it and reading from it.
So it seems likely that the Gospel of Peter really isn't, and that if you wanted to see what a real Gospel of Peter would look like, it probably is the Gospel of Mark.
Possible, but again, when it comes to whether Mark is writing from Peter or not, is just, that's just an oral tradition.
Right. I was going to ask that too, like how sure are people that Mark and Peter were...
Scholars, they wouldn't say it was definite. They'd call it Gospel of Mark, though.
But what I mean is, how sure were they that Mark and Peter were really that close? Even?
Well, that's again, this is basically the first letter of Peter, the epistle that actually has Peter's name on it and is attributed to him. Does mention greetings to you from those in Babylon, together with Mark, my son.
Oh wow, okay, that's pretty strong.
But not necessarily his actual son.
Well, yeah, but it's still a strong.
Yes. It's kind of like if.
Not like some guy I met at the deli,
Yeah, exactly. But again, is it the same Mark that wrote?
Oh, it could be a different Mark.
Could be a different Mark.
Could be a different Mark.
It also doesn't help that 1 Peter is hypothesized as also being a forgery.
Well, and it's not like they had a great system of identification or whatever.
No,
someone could just say that maybe there was a Mark who was going with Peter and everything, and they were really close, and the Mark that wrote the Gospel of Mark was just claiming to be that Mark or something. I mean, I imagine that they've done some detective work there, but
definitely. Well, another quite an early thing that is actually in the Renewed Covenant is mentioned in Acts 12:12. Basically, in Acts 12, which we're not going to get to for quite a while, Peter gets put in prison. Peter manages to get out of prison by the help of an angel or a messenger of God. And after he gets out, he goes to it says, this is Acts 12:12. When he realized this, when he exited the prison, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, when many were gathered together and were praying. So again, it's a very early tradition was that, Peter got out of jail and then immediately went to John Mark's house. So both of them being quite close, there's quite a long history
of that.
Even to the point that it's even in, Acts. So you got the author of Acts also.
It's funny because I was thinking that if the Gospel of Mark really is mostly Peter,
mm-hmm.
and it was so influential for Matthew and Luke,
mm-hmm.
and then you have all the stuff written by Paul, and there's a lot of stuff from Paul. I mean, the New Testament suddenly starts to look like it's mostly just Peter and Paul, doesn't it? I mean,
kind of.
It starts narrowing down and starts looking like there's fewer and fewer original ideas in there.
Yeah, well,
it's a lot of influence.
You've got the possible 13, possible 14 letters of Paul. Then you've just got Matthew. Got Matthew writing Matthew. You've got Mark writing Mark. But again, if it's Peter, then it's also Peter. Then you got 1 and 2 Peter, which would be Peter. Luke and Acts are written by the same author. So again, Luke and Acts, and then obviously John, the disciple John or the apostle John, whatever the hell you want to call him. I prefer to call him Euchanon, the delegate. He's got his own eyewitness account. He's got his 3 letters, and he also has Revelation as well. So Euchanon John is quite in there in the renewed covenant. About 20% of it is it John Euchanon. 25% of it is Acts and Luke due to the size of Acts and Luke.
Yeah, I know. Well, Acts is so big it's broken up into 2 parts, right? So
yeah, pretty much, yeah.
But if Luke really did take influence from Mark and Mark got influence from Peter, then you've got.
Well, Luke is more considered the follower of Paul.
I see, but then still, it's Paul. It goes back to Peter or Paul, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, you essentially do have those 2 as kind of like the main protagonists for the whole of the New Covenant.
Yeah, I didn't realize how influential Peter and Paul were for the New Testament or the renewed covenant. I didn't.
When it comes to the tradition, basically Peter and Paul, are quite well up there, which is probably why in the mid-2nd century, the Church of Rome starts really trying to force forward this Paul and Peter being there at Rome, being in the church together and everything. When we eventually get the Pope being on the seat of Peter and whatnot, it's all one of those things that just you don't realise, but then you go, all right, so that's why. Because if you ever read Paul's letter to the Romans, basically the Roman ecclesia, Roman church, was there long before he even stepped foot there. It was already around before he'd managed to get to it. And then about the mid-2nd century, they kind of like push forward the idea that Peter founded it.
I see, even though that's not really...
Even though it's bollocks. That's why Peter was called the first pope, when he wasn't.
I've heard that. Yeah, I've definitely heard that.
Yeah, the See of Peter is what the Church of Rome is called. Then you've got the See of Constantinople and the See of Alexandria. I hadn't heard that people thought Mark would have written it in Syria or Palestine, because I always heard that it was considered that it might have been written in Alexandria in Egypt.
Yeah. You can't. I mean, Wikipedia is whatever it is.
yeah. When it comes down to Wiki, the scriptural type articles, people do actually reference everything.
Yeah, I mean,
there's like a Bible Wiki project and everything.
There's like 90 references here, and it looks like it's been pretty well. But, there's a lot of different ideas out there, and, whatever the stronger one is that happens to have a presence online is going to take it over, and so...
One of the main things you said that I didn't like was the reference of Mark as a bishop.
Yeah, so and they also called him a C, like you said. This, and so this is why I'm asking, because I never go to Wikipedia and assume that what I'm reading is true. I assume that it's probably true, especially if it's something that's easy to verify. But again, if I trusted Wikipedia, I would just read Wikipedia. So, but this was my my starting spot, So. So I figured you would have problems with something in here.
Yeah. You see, the Roman Catholics would try and put forth that, Mark was a bishop. Because, that would give, credence to their popes and bishops and archbishops and...
Well, they have done a fair bit of revisionist history, haven't they? I mean, that's...
Pardon?
I mean, the Catholic Church has done a fair bit of revisionist history.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially when it comes to their own organization, because... You have a lot of claims. I find it interesting, the claims that are made about the unbroken lineages and all this stuff. I expect that in an Episcopal structure in the Catholic Church. You're going all the way back to Peter and all that. I've heard that before, that the line could be traced all the way back to Peter and all this stuff. And
that's called apostolic succession.
Yeah.
Oh, basically, the laying on of hands of basically every Roman Catholic bishop, whatever, goes all the way. Basically, the Holy Spirit being laid onto them goes all the way back to Peter doing it.
Because you have to have this divine authority. That's
every sort of church that has its own different structure tries to force their church structure back to New Testament times, as they're called, or at least before the end of the 1st century CE. The problem is, from what we actually know, church structure, ecclesia structure, was different everywhere. So, one ecclesia might have had, one sole person in charge, like a bishop, but then another ecclesia, church, would have, several elders in charge.
Yeah.
There wasn't, when we start getting to the 4th century CE, a systematic structure.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that's a pretty common desire. People want history to be clean and simple and unified, and to have this one coherent story that just smoothly, moves along from one era to the next. And I remember one case of that was with the Vikings, because I was designing a board game, and it was about Vikings and... invading the Lindisfarne Monastery, which is the first known Viking attack on England. And I found out a lot of interesting things about Vikings doing that research, which is that, so even back in the 1400s, they tried to paint this picture of them being these horrible savages. Then as people took a closer look, they realized, well, no, actually genealogical stuff shows that they had settlements that were slowly encroaching, but they weren't necessarily hostile because they were having kids together and stuff, and the cultures were mingling. The idea about Vikings has changed over time as they've learned more and more, and it's become more complicated, and that clear-cut narrative of them being these bloodthirsty savages has had to change from, well, yeah, some of them were bloodthirsty savages, and yes, there were some attacks, but some of them were nice, and there were settlements, and all this kind of thing. So I imagine that has to be the case with the Catholic Church as well. I mean, back then, I'm sure things were very messy, and it was just getting on its feet, and communications. Can you imagine if we had communications like we have now back then? I mean, if you wanted to talk to someone who was far away, you had to send a messenger or something like that, and it could take days or weeks or months to reach them, and then you're waiting for a reply. Now I could pick up the phone and talk to anyone anywhere in the world thanks to satellites, and or Skype, and they just didn't have that. So yeah, I'm sure all these communities and these different churches had their own thing going on. Why wouldn't they? The cultures weren't as homogenized, and also the communication wasn't as frequent. So, of course, the church has to go. But now the church, wants to set this unified message, so they have to go back and say, "Oh no, it was always good." There was never any problems. Yeah.
it's always like we are now.
Right, exactly.
It's always been that way. But it'd just be a lot easier to say, yeah, no, it wasn't always like this. This is just the way we've gone.
Well, they can't admit that, hey, we're an organization just like any other, and we had our growing pains in the past, because they are using this argument of divine authority. From the hand of Peter,
From the hand of God.
From the hand of God.
Through to Peter, who we referred to as a Satan. Right, okay. It's just one of those things, isn't it? But, as you say, they're an organisation. They've drummed it into people for years now, saying, this is all from the hand of God. It's always been like this. Yet history says no.
Yeah.
You're full of bollocks. But I think nowadays, obviously people in the church wouldn't, but people outside the church, or whatever church, the Roman Catholic would probably respect them more if they just turned around and said, yeah, no, it wasn't like this. History is shown.
Well, I think the average Catholic, the intelligent ones anyway, they know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do know that, but
I think
they're not willing to admit it.
I think the number of Catholics who really just are diehard and believe anything out of the mouth of the Pope is really a small percentage of all the Catholics, I think.
I don't know, because when the Pope goes anywhere, there's a whole load of everyone going to see them.
Well, yeah, they all want to go see him, but that doesn't mean they just blindly believe anything he says. I hope.
You hope, but because
I've met a lot of intelligent Catholics who were perfectly willing to. They say they do, but they don't really. I mean, they don't behave like they really believe it.
It's very much like with politics, to be honest, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but if you have a political party, you have the diehards who go and knock on doors and make phone calls and flyers, and they're there at the primaries and everything. I don't know exactly how it works in Britain, but over here we have primaries. And a big part of the primary system here is that you're voting for the people, you're voting for the person who will represent that party on the final election. So you'll have several people in the same party vying to be the person who represents the whole party, and the primary is the election to choose the representative for the whole party. And so what you see is that the extreme, the minority, the extreme minority, are the only ones motivated to go vote during the primaries. So that politicians have to walk a very fine line between acting very hardcore during primary season so that they can get the hardcore vote and get through the primaries to be the official candidate. But then once they have that endorsement...
Then they mellow out a bit.
Yeah, they have to mellow out because now they have to try and appeal to people in the middle and people maybe even on the other side. Because if you're too radical, people won't vote for you in the general election. So that's definitely... I forgot what we were talking about, but that's...
But no, that's interesting about the Vikings, definitely. I know very little about the Vikings.
I didn't either, actually. But
despite, them invading my land.
Oh, we were talking about the people, Catholics, and how or any religious. Yeah, right.
Under the such churches who say no, it's all like this. No, it wasn't. It was all very different, as you said, because obviously it took ages to get messages to people. By the time a message would eventually get to them, they'll be like, oh, well, we've kind of already been doing this for the past couple of months and it's working.
Right.
You've sent us a message saying, no, don't do that, do it this way. Why? Why change something that's currently working?
We're already doing... Hey, look busy, Jesus is coming, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's that intro to Mark. The other thing...
Yeah, we started getting fairly off topic there, but we should...
Yeah. Anyway.
Was there anything else you wanted to rebuke him in my little assertions there?
No, we've gone over the proper name. We've gone over the fact that he wasn't a bishop. It may have been the memoirs of Peter. The other thing you mentioned was the Q source.
Right, Q source, yeah.
Again, that is, that's a hypothesis and speculation that has absolutely no factual basis to it. It was just brought in as a way to explain the three synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of how they had quite similar material, but not always the same material. Actually, Luke and Matthew had a bit more to go on. Mark doesn't have quite. But again, even when Matthew or Luke take look like they're taking sections from Mark, sometimes in Mark it can be twice as long as that in Matthew. So it's not like they duplicate everything constantly.
Do you know if they used any well-known literary techniques to derive this Q hypothesis, or was that just...
It's just a way to explain, basically Q is basically, the German scholars came up with the Q is just short for quell, basically just meaning like source.
Yeah.
Just means source, and that's it. So it was just like a hypothesis to explain those similarities plus the extra bits in Matthew and Luke. Basically, they were all kind of going from this Q source, which was just a list of sayings and other things that had been either been written down or orally transmitted. But again, there's absolutely no evidence that this Q existed. There's no mention of it in the early Ecclesia Fathers. There's no manuscript of this.
I do find it kind of, the nerdy side of me immediately had to make the connection, because the Q source is supposed to be things about that Jesus said, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
And Jesus is supposed to be God, Mm-hmm. Well, on Star Trek, there's a character named Q who's basically God, so I just...
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. Funny little
but it's also to explain like some of the like the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, which has kind of other extra sayings of Jesus, but also has kind of sometimes similar sayings like that seen in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
It sounds to me like you don't buy the Q hypothesis then.
No, it's
or is it just doesn't matter really? It's really... It
doesn't really matter, to be honest. However, no, I don't buy it at all, because there's just absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever. Another hypothesis is basically that Mark really did write the memoirs of Peter, and then Matthew and Luke built up on it. Basically, Mark was written first. They both got a copy, and then obviously expanded it using either. Because Luke, at the start of Luke, it says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us." Quite possibly a reference to Mark and Matthew, because obviously Matthew being one of the 12 apostles or the delegates, and also Mark writing Peter's memoirs, who was also one of the 12 delegates. It's good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning things you have been taught. So Luke there is basically saying others have already written things prior to him, narrative-wise, but he has brought it all, kind of put it into an orderly account, an actual like historical record of what happened where and when.
Gotcha.
Rather than Matthew and Mark have subject matters in certain chapters, and then the next chapter is a different subject matter that they want to talk about. Like when we get to Matthew, we'll see the Sermon on the Mount, which lasts for chapters 5, 6, and 7. But those very same sayings are also found in Luke, but in different places. Not all in the same place, like they are in Matthew, but kind of dotted around Luke's narrative. So Luke is basically saying at the start of his that he's doing a more, without the actual dates, but an actual ordered account. Whereas the others basically saying that the others didn't do; they were just writing what they could remember, where and when.
It's kind of like detective work. You got these people saying, you got these 4 different accounts, which largely line up.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's inconsistencies that aren't necessarily opposed or exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have one gospel that has it all in one place and another one that has it in another place, it's like looking through different colored lenses, and you have to try and figure out where the actual, truth is and all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what do you place in? Do you think one gospel is more accurate than the others?
In what way? What do you mean accurate? Do you mean more? As I said, like Luke said, his is the more ordered accounts, whereas Mark's and Matthew's are a bit more loose with how things. Yeah, actually, I would. I'd say that Luke has done what he said. He's put a proper ordered account through, whereas Matthew and Mark basically remembering what they could. Oh, well, obviously, in Mark's case, remember what Peter was telling him. And writing that.
Because you do believe that Jesus was the Messiah, so if you had
I do believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, yeah.
So if you had to... So if someone said to you, we're going to delete every gospel from the history except one, and that's the one you get to put in everyone's hands, you'd pick Luke and not the others.
No, actually, I'd probably choose John.
Oh, okay, that's interesting then. So if you had to pick one... So you find there's a little more credibility to Luke because, as you say, he was a little more orderly about it and a little more detailed. But you would actually...
I wouldn't put it like that. It is more... Obviously, as far as I'm concerned, what Mark and Matthew say is also true.
Right.
But they're not necessarily giving, an exact, this happened then, and then immediately after this happened there. Obviously, there are certain sections in Matthew and Mark where that does happen, but they more or less do line up with where Luke has them. Whereas Luke, he is actually doing a more, proper ordered. So, Messiah said this there, something else happened in between, and then somewhere else he said them there. Whereas Matthew says the Messiah said these and these things, but he's missed out the bits in between, or has the bits in between. Basically, it's kind of like when you see in films when they kind of go back, go back for
flashback.
Flashback. You don't want to go flashback. So obviously that's already happened, but so you're not distracted from what's currently happening. They have what's currently happening all at once, and then if something else has happened at that time, they do a little flashback to show what's already happened. That's kind of like how I picture Matthew and Mark. Whereas Luke is, giving it exactly as it happened, regardless.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll save discussions for why you would pick. You said John, if there was the one you had to give to people. We'll save that for when we get to John, because this is about Mark right now. Yes, but what do you think about the idea that he's the first one, though? Does that lend any? I
think that has the most plausibility to it. Well, there's nothing to counteract that, really.
Does that give it any special credence, though, being the first, or does that not matter at all? Because it sounds like, because I know when it comes to this stuff, and I didn't know this before I started looking into the Bible, that first isn't necessarily best, because it sounds like, and this is one thing I guess you did, that Mark was really a Greek. He wasn't Greek, but Greek was like the language for him. So when he went back to the Old Testament, it wasn't in Hebrew. It was in Greek.
Oh right, no, this is. Oh, sorry,
or is that not true?
You are bringing up the other objection I had because you said that apparently when you said you'd seen it said that when Mark quoted the Old Testament, it was quoted from the Greek,
right?
From the Greek Septuagint. I'm staring at Isaiah, right? Sorry, I'm not staring. I will staring at it. I am staring at a quote of Isaiah 6 verses 9 to 10. That is quoted in Mark 4:12. I can tell you right now, it's not the Greek Septuagint.
Okay.
Whoever said that
was wrong.
Has quite possibly never seen the Greek Septuagint, because you cannot say that and then look at the quotes from the Greek Septuagint from the Tanakh in Mark and say, right, he's definitely quoting from the Greek Septuagint.
Okay.
No, none of them. Some of them do quote it word for word in certain things, but not all the time.
Because I was thinking, had that been the case, and you're saying that's not.
No, I'm staring at it now.
It could be that some of the newer, and new is a relative term. I mean, we're talking about a difference of 50, 60 years or something between the oldest one and the newest one or something like that. So, it could be that one of the newer ones is actually better because it, used better sources or something.
Yeah, possibly. Just because Mark's first doesn't necessarily mean it's the best account. However, the good thing about Mark is that it's short. It gets to the point and gets through it all straight away for everyone. So if you wanted to learn something about the Messiah, basically I actually would point someone towards Mark.
It's too bad that the autobiography wasn't more popular, because we could have had the Gospel of Jesus himself, and then
we could have had the Gospel of Yeshua. Yeah. Right. So to surmise,
the TLDR.
Yeah, too long. Or TLDL in this case. Too long.
Yeah, too long didn't listen.
Too long didn't listen. TLDL. Basically, the eyewitness account of Mark, also known as John Mark, or his full name is Johann Marcos. Quite possibly could be the memoirs of Simon Peter. Quite possibly couldn't be the memoirs of Simon Peter. It could be based on a source called Q. Probably isn't based on a source called Q. 16 chapters long. He wasn't the first bishop or a bishop to any ecclesia or church. He didn't quote from the Greek Septuagint verbatim. He didn't, from what I can look at right now, he didn't really quote from the Greek Septuagint at all. He was known to Paul and Barnabas, and from what we can see, Peter as well, and Luke. And his account isn't necessarily exactly in the order that everything happened.
So, once again, we're forced to come to the conclusion that we don't know a hell of a lot, other than that the Catholic Church is full of crap.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's really the one conclusion we can come back to. Yeah.
The only fact we got to is, actually, no.
The only constants in life, death, taxes, and the Catholic Church is full of it, basically.
We don't know much about Mark. All we know is that what the Catholic Church has said is just what the Catholic Church says. It's just utter bollocks.
There's one message to take away. The Gospel of Andrew and Stephen. I finally found, I've been looking for it, I found a place where it talks about that. When the book references the Old Testament, it does so in the form in which it had been translated into Greek, the Septuagint, for instance, Mark 1:2, 23 through 28, chapter 10, 48b, chapter 12, 18 through 27, and it compares chapter 2:10 with Daniel 7, 13 through 14. So, okay, right. So there you go.
Disagree.
There you go. No, got it.
Not only will I disagree, I will prove it.
It's funny. There's actually no reference for that. So, there's links, but there's no reference as far as I can see. So, tisk tisk, Wikipedia. You're gonna have to get on there and edit this.
Mm.
We need to do our own. We need to do the Godcast Bible, which is
Godcast Bible Wiki.
The Godcast Bible Wiki, and it'll be the Andrew and Stephen version. Why are 50% of the pages making fun of the Catholic Church? Look, this is our wiki, okay?
It's not our fault.
Apparently, the Catholic Church sucks. Bacon is awesome. I don't understand this wiki at all. I thought this was about the Bible. But it definitely will not tell you that Mark took from the Septuagint. All right, so that, I think, wraps up our intro for Mark. It was a lot of fun. I thought it was fun, but I'm looking at you. What's his name? Mr. YouTube commenter man. Hopefully, so this time we took an episode to get to the reading.
We've not even done the reading.
We're not even done the reading yet.
It's just an intro. He's going to be severely pissed.
Now we're going to get a comment that says, I wish you would have taken a little longer to develop first. All right, so that about wraps it up for us on this episode, but we're recording the next episode right after this, so hopefully they will be released close together, and you can listen to the intro and the first part of the reading fairly close to each other. thank you for joining us. We had a great time. Have a great afternoon, evening. I've been your host, Andrew, along with Steven.
Bye.
And have a great day. We'd like to thank SacJoe22 for releasing her version of A Prayer under the Creative Commons 3.0 license, which allowed us to use it in our podcast. If you'd like to find more music by SacJoe22, visit ccmixter.org/files/SacJoe, SACKJO22/36192. And for more information about the Creative Commons 3.0 license, visit creativecommons.org/licenses/by-nc/3.0. Thank you.